Hey there, everybody. Welcome to AMC Movie News. My name is John Campea, Editor-In-Chief of AMC Movie News, and I'm doing this quick editorial on how Robin, the Boy Wonder, can work in the DC cinematic universe. Now, for those of you who've been following AMC Movie News for any length of time, you know that I have often said that Robin, the classical Robin, as most of us associate him in our heads, simply cannot work in the DC cinematic universe. In this post-Christopher Nolan Batman world, a Robin doesn't work. Now, Robin is one of my favorite comic book characters. I've got a couple of buddies of mine up in Canada who he is their absolute favorite comic book character. And Robin, in many of his incarnations, in both animation and in the comic books, works really well. However, what I've always said before is that he doesn't work in the post-Nolan era. Well, what are we talking about? For us to fully understand what I mean when I say how Robin can work in the DC cinematic universe, first let me give you the context of why I've said he can't. And in this sense, I simply have always meant he can't as in the traditional Robin. What I mean by that is this. The traditional Robin, of course, is, Dick Grayson, brought on Bruce Wayne to Bruce Wayne as his ward, trains him and starts taking him from, if I understand right in the cartoons and in the comic books, like as early as the age of 12 or 13, brings him into crime fighting. When Robin was first introduced in the comic books, many of you know this, he was specifically brought in simply to appeal to children. The idea by the comic book creators was that they needed a character in which little kids can associate with and identify with. And thus, Robin was created to, be alongside Batman so little children could kind of fantasize themselves fighting crime alongside of Batman. And that has always worked in the comic books, and they've even made it work in the animation world. However, my argument had always been that in the post-Christopher Nolan era, this new Batman we have, and why Christopher Nolan always flatly refused to put Robin in any of their movies, is that this Batman that we know now, this dark, more gritty, more quote-unquote realistic Batman, would not bring a child into a crime-fighting war. He would not bring a 12 or 13 or 14-year-old child into a big gunfight with a bunch of mobsters. That is simply not what this Batman would do. It would never fit. It would never feel in place or feel like it would work. Now, whenever I've brought that up, I have found three main comparisons that people try to throw at me to say, see, John, this example means that Robin could work, but none of them apply. And here's the three most popular ones. Number one, people try to compare Robin to Hit Girl. After all, John, you say that Hit Girl is an amazing character in an amazing film. Well, Hit Girl is the same age as Robin was, so therefore Robin works. Well, the problem is Hit Girl doesn't apply. You see, Hit Girl comes from the movie Kick-Ass, which is a silly spoof comedy that is supposed to be, on every level, just completely ridiculous and nonsensical. That's what Kick-Ass is. Batman versus Superman, Dark Knight, all that kind of stuff, none of those are supposed to be silly and stupid and dumb and ridiculous. Therein lies the genius of Kick-Ass and why Kick-Ass is so great. But it's not what the new Batman is. In that Kick-Ass world, it's funny and ridiculous, and the outlandishness of this dad bringing his 12 or 13-year-old daughter into these gunfights and shooting her in the chest while wearing a bulletproof vest. That works in a movie like Kick-Ass. That doesn't work in a movie with a tone that's a quote-unquote more realistic, like Batman. Now, other people say, well, John, since when is it realistic for a guy to run around in a bat costume and fight crime? And all I can really say to that is this. If you don't know the difference between a movie like The Dark Knight and a movie like Kick-Ass, then I simply don't know how to help you. If you don't know the difference, you're beyond help. Clearly, there's a big difference, and that's why this whole comparison of Hit Girl to Robin doesn't apply. Now, the second comparison, a lot of people will try to say, well, John, Spider-Man. Spider-Man, they're saying in the new Spider-Man movies coming up that he's probably going to be 15 or 16 years old. And you said that's a great idea, so how come it isn't a great idea for Robin? Well, because Spider-Man doesn't apply as a comparison. Because the problem that I have with Robin isn't that Robin, as a young child, runs off and fights crime. The problem I have is that Batman condones it, and that Batman trains a child, and Batman brings a child along with him into these crime-fighting things. That's not the case with Spider-Man. Spider-Man doesn't have an adult dragging him into crime fighting. Spider-Man does not have an adult condoning him going into crime fighting, but that's not even the biggest difference. The biggest difference that makes Spider-Man a totally like a non-starting point for comparing him to Robin is the fact that Robin is a kid with a stick. Spider-Man is a superpowered being. You know, if you look up the statistics with Marvel Comics, for a long time, Spider-Man was able to lift up to 25 tons. 25 tons. Now, since they've downpowered him, most normally, according to Marvel, he's listed as being able to lift 10 tons or 20,000 pounds. All right? He has superhuman agility. He has superhuman speeds. He had spider sense. He is an immortal being in many ways. I mean, he can die, but you know what I mean? He is a god. You know, he could pick up a small car and crush it in his hands. Any being that can lift 20,000 pounds can do that. That's not Robin. So because of all of those things, comparing Robin to the Spider-Man situation simply does not apply. Now, the third one that people often try to compare, and oddly enough, there's actually a little bit right on the nose with this, but you'll see what I say, but is Bucky from Winter Soldier. Now, a lot of people would say, John, Bucky was a little cartoon character created for children as a little kid sidekick to Captain America, and you saw Captain America Winter Soldier, and you said you loved it, so why can't Robin work? Well, Winter Soldier doesn't apply. Bucky doesn't apply because the Bucky we got in Captain America bears very little similarity to the Bucky in the graphic novel, to the Bucky in the comic books. This Bucky in the movies was not Captain America's little kid sidekick. This was a totally different thing. In the movie, they reinvented Bucky, almost as Captain America's big brother figure. And that's the guy we saw in the Winter Soldier. So you see, there's no comparison between Bucky and Robin. Therefore, Bucky, the situation does not apply. Well, John, that's great. We've heard you say all this time about how you don't think Robin, can work in the DC Cinematic Universe, but you said there's ways he can. Absolutely he can. Now, this isn't a change of heart on my part. I've been saying this all along. But bear with me as I want to suggest to you, those who are Robin fans, and maybe those of you who aren't Robin fans, who just wholeheartedly say no Robin incarnation to work, let me explain to you why I personally believe there are ways that a Robin character could work. And let's start with the guy we just talked about, Bucky, the Winter Soldier. You see, while I don't think Bucky can be applied when comparing himself to Robin because of all the differences that we talked about, I still think what they did with Bucky in the Captain America movies, especially Captain America Winter Soldier, I think therein lies a blueprint in which a Dick Grayson, or whether it's a Tim Drake, or whether it's a Jason Todd, or whether it's, Damian Wayne, or whoever you want to have, therein lies a blueprint with the Winter Soldier that I think a Robin-esque character can work. Now, notice I'm saying Robin-esque. I said Bucky with quotes because the Bucky we got in the movie really wasn't the Bucky that we had in the comic books in many ways, shapes, and forms, for the most traditional understanding of Bucky. They made changes to him, but still took that core character and said, this is Bucky, this is Winter Soldier, and they made it work. Just a much older guy, no longer the younger sidekick to Captain America, now an older brother figure, all that kind of stuff. I believe there are ways you can do this with Robin. Now, some of you might be saying, John, they tried that before. Remember when they had that guy playing Robin opposite of George Clooney? That didn't work out so well. Granted, that didn't work out so well, but there was a lot of different problems with that movie, and I think aging up Robin was not the main problem. You see, what you can do, I think, in the DC Cinematic Universe that not only makes Robin acceptable, but even work, and maybe even work really well, is take some of the elements of Robin that do exist, eliminate some of the other ones that are problematic, and what you're left with is still a pretty damn compelling character that could function in a really cool way. Let's, for argument's sake, just look at the character of Dick Grayson, all right? Now, that is the most longest running Robin. That is the guy we most associate Robin with. He was Robin for 70 years, or however long Dick Grayson was Robin for. But for those of you who know your comic books, he evolves. He becomes Nightwing. I mean, he has a bit of a falling out with Batman. He wants to be his own man. He becomes Nightwing. At some point, he and Batman really have a spat, to the point where when Batman had to go away, he didn't go to Dick Grayson to become the Batman for him. He went to Azrael instead. And then when Bruce Wayne came back and got rid of Azrael in the whole Nightfall series, when that all concluded, my favorite scene all time in any comic book ever, my favorite scene in comics in history, is after Bruce got rid of Azrael, Bruce and Dick are standing in the Batcave. And Dick is finally having it out with them. Dick is hurt emotionally because when Batman needed help the most, he needed somebody to take over the mantle of the Bat while he went away and healed after Bane broke his back. Dick was hurt that Batman didn't come to him, that Bruce didn't come to him. And he's like, why did you go to somebody outside the family? Why didn't you trust me? You know, that whole conversation. And then you could really tell it was the pain of a son. And in the great conclusion of the scene, I can't remember the word for word rendition of it, but basically, Bruce puts his hand on Dick's shoulders and basically compares them to father and son. He goes, this is the way of things with fathers and sons. And it's one of the most beautiful moments ever in comic books. I believe if you take that Dick Grayson and you suggest a history, a non-Robin history between Bruce and Dick, you can even stick with the classic beginnings of Dick Grayson and say, look, he was an acrobat with his family. His family was tragically murdered. And seeing the similarities between himself and now this kid and what happened with his parents, Bruce Wayne decided to take on a ward. But then you eliminate all the Robin stuff. Maybe Dick Grayson trained himself or maybe whatever you want to do. But then say later in life, 19, 20, 21 years old, still young. At that point, Dick Grayson decided to become Nightwing. You could even go with Robin, but I think in the big screen rendition, I think most people would agree, even diehard Robin fans would agree, that introducing them as Nightwing becomes a very feasible thing to do. Now, some people have been speculating that in the new Batman versus Superman, that maybe, the Joker killed Jason Todd at some point. By the way, that's all speculation. Nobody from Warner Brothers has ever said that. But let's say that is the case. You could even say that, Bruce had a ward at one point. Let's say it was Jason Todd or Jason Todd type. He doesn't necessarily have to have been Robin. You can come up with a million different reasons and excuses why the Joker at some point ended up murdering the ward of Bruce Wayne. Even if he wasn't Robin as a child, you never have to go into that problem area of Batman, this post-Christopher Nolan Batman, taking a child into a war on crime. You can just say he was his ward, he was his adopted son or whatever, and the Joker, through one way or another, through one set of circumstances or another, ends up murdering the ward of Bruce Wayne, whether that's Jason Todd or a young Dick Grayson or a Tim Drake or whoever it is. And then you take another incarnation of that, say Dick Grayson or Jason Todd or Tim Drake or whoever, Damian Wayne even, I don't know, and say, go with that first scenario, that Bucky scenario, that Winter Soldier scenario where age it up just by 5, 6, 7 years. And suddenly now you get all the fullness and the richness of a Dick Grayson character as Nightwing, embodying that role of Robin, right? But without the problematic stuff that just doesn't fit in with the tone of this new DC cinematic universe. A Batman bringing a child into crime fighting? I get it. It works in the comic books. It does. I get it. It works in the animated series. It does. But my belief is still is that classical understanding of Robin just doesn't fit in this DC cinematic universe. Just like in the Marvel universe, that classical rendition of Bucky didn't fit in with the Marvel cinematic universe. They took a blueprint though, they aged up Bucky, they made him a different character but still called him Bucky, and then it worked and worked in spades. And I believe that if you did the same thing with a Dick Grayson type character, get rid of the 12-year-old crime fighter altogether, start with a 19, 20, 21-year-old Dick Grayson who is now going out on his own and fighting crime as Nightwing, maybe even a little bit older, who knows, and becomes an ally to Batman. In that sense, you get all of the payoff of a Robin without any of the problematic areas of a Robin. I think not only can it work, I think it could work huge. Now, I've actually been saying this all along. I've said for a long time, look, yes, you can age him up, you can go Nightwing, just as long as Robin fans understand that that's no longer the classical Robin, and it's not. But you can still capture some of the elements of the classical Robin while getting rid of the problems. Anyway, that's my quick thought on how you could make a Robin-type character work and work well in the DC cinematic universe. Look, I know there's going to be lots of you that disagree, and that's part of the fun here. We get to talk about comic book characters and what we think they can or cannot do, and that's the great thing. So let me know what you like about my theory. Let me know what you don't like about my theory. Let's just have a great discussion about this character who's so rich in the comics, and if there's a way that he could work in this new Zack Snyder DC Cinematic Universe. Anyway, that'll do it for me right now. Thanks a lot for joining me for this editorial. My name is John Campea for AMC Movie News. Until next time, bye-bye.